Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts. And every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black, everything.
Welcome to Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We are joined today by Professor Michael Ralph, who's Associate Professor in the Department of Social and Cultural Analysis at New York University, where he's also the Director of the Metropolitan Studies Program. He's the author of the book Forensics of Capital, which was published by University of Chicago Press 2015, of which noted scholar Mamadou Diop writes, Forensics of Capital uncovers new theoretical and ethnographic pathways that will have important implications for both African studies and anthropology scholarship. How are you doing, Michael?
Pleasure.
Pleasure to have you join us here. Talk a little bit about this book, and let's start with the title,
Sure.
which is so catchy, right? Forensics of Capital. So what exactly are you talking about there?
Well, thank you for the invitation to be here. It's an honor. Forensics of Capital, I guess in doing the research for the book, it started as doctoral research for my PhD in anthropology at the University of Chicago, and I was really interested in Senegal and economic and political transformation.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Senegal, on the one hand, is an economic and political diplomatic leader in Africa. On the other hand, it has had historically a really high level of debt, indebtedness, 50% unemployment,
Mm-hmm.
and you know, I noticed that like more than 50% of that unemployment rate was made up by what was called urban youth, young people. So it was both a kind of unemployment problem and youth labor problem. And so initially I was sort of thinking about economic crisis in Senegal versus its sort of standing as a diplomatic, cultural leader. But as I was doing the sort of revisions to make it into a book, I got really interested in the story of how Senegal became this kind of country that on the one hand was highly regarded and highly respected, and yet sort of struggled economically. And that to me suggested that there was something about Senegal's profile that was both useful but misleading, maybe, you know? Like I wondered how Senegal came to be seen as this really successful country, but also what that profile might be hiding.
Yeah, you mentioned, right, it's if you're talking about a diplomatic profile, it's also a credit profile,
Right, yeah.
and a forensic profile, right?
Right. So I basically argue that like Senegal has long had this standing among privileged nations as a kind of democratic nation, sort of peaceful nation, and so I try to unpack that. So what I look at is the fact that colonialism unfolded differently in Senegal than it did in other places. You know, it was not by conquest as such. In fact, you know, when European merchants and political officials came to that region, they had to sort of negotiate with sovereign leaders of kingdoms. There were Islamic marabouts who led really influential peasant sort of movements. There were Serer peoples who sort of hid in the woods as Europeans arrived and cultivated sort of important ritual traditions. There were seigneurs, or women who had partnerships and unions with traders, and their offspring, their kind of biracial, multiracial offspring, inherited wealth and land and access to capital and sort of acquired important linguistic skills. So conquest or sort of colonial relations had this kind of cosmopolitan diplomatic negotiations built into it that sort of ended up enabling Senegal to acquire this reputation as a place where it was very diplomatic, right? Rather than a place sort of marked by conquest and insurgency and things like that. So that has sort of historically been part of the way Senegal is viewed. And even to this day, Senegal is seen as this very cosmopolitan, coastal sort of polity that has these long-standing ties with European countries and whose standing is in part premised on what privileged nations say about it and how they see it.
And, I mean, there's some contradictions there, right? You mentioned that this is, in some ways, a socialist nation that's been very anti-Russia.
Right.
They've signed on a lot of efforts in the U.S. in terms of anti-terror, though it is a country that has a significant amount of Muslims.
Right.
What do you think some of these European nations, what was it about Senegal?
Well, I think that part of the history of sort of nation states is this, what I think of as a kind of forensic profile, this idea of character, right? That certain countries are seen to have the right comportment, or certain countries are sort of forced to adopt a certain kind of comportment that is sort of translated as the way that the people essentially are, right? So a nation that has long-standing ties to privileged nations, especially privileged European nations, is then regarded as having the right character, a comportment to participate in diplomacy in a certain way, right? And other countries that take a different political stance, that stance is sometimes translated into kind of standing as a rogue nation, or a terrorist watch list nation, or a nation that is sort of inherently unjust, authoritarian, despotic. And I guess what interests me is, like any profile, the empirical evidence can be out of sync with the sort of characterization attached to that nation, right? So like one thing that's interesting about Senegal's standing is that it has long participated in structural adjustment programs, but those programs have actually contributed to further indebtedness. And there are other countries that don't participate as heavily in structural adjustment, but it's sometimes viewed as suspicious, you know? Especially countries that sort of focus exclusively or heavily on, say, mining and manufacturing are often viewed with a greater degree of suspicion. And the analogy I use in class is like, you know, there's nothing inherently suspicious, for instance, about using cash instead of staying off the grid. But if the police pulled you over and you had 2 suitcases full of cash in your trunk, they wonder what you're up to, right? And, you know, if someone's ever accused of a crime, the first thing they do is sort of pull your credit, to see what kind of money or your debit cards. So there's a way in which a credit system is also a system of surveillance. There's also a system of profiling. I think that's true for both people and nations, and that's part of what I argue in the book.
You mentioned a high rate of unemployment in Senegal. How has the country, its leadership, been able to police responses, right? And we don't hear a lot of stories about, you know, unrest in Senegal, you know, the way that we might hear in some African nations.
Right, that's a great point. I think that, you know, one thing that Senegalese scholars have done, I think, is sort of try to explore this contradiction between the way the country is viewed and what's happening locally. So from Mamadou Diouf to Suleiman Bachir Diagne, Fatou Sek, all kinds of scholars are sort of exploring in greater detail sort of the nuances of political and social life in Senegal. But I do think because Senegal participates at a high rate in international governing projects, that sort of contributes to the idea that it's inherently democratic. So for instance, Senegal basically only uses its military for UN and African Union peacekeeping missions. And so by participating so actively in what's understood as the spread of democracy, Senegal solidifies its reputation as a just and democratic country. By being at the vanguard of sort of economic liberalization programs, and sort of by promoting the consensus of European nations, of the US, of the UN, Senegal sort of solidifies its reputation that, as you point out, sort of masks often what's happening at the ground, where journalists will talk about being harassed by the state or by police, or people sort of are more critical of that trajectory are sometimes historically sort of sidelined or marginalized.
You're trained as an anthropologist. What brings you to this project? I remember when we first met, and this has to be maybe 13 years ago. I want to say it was a hip hop conference in Chicago.
It was, yes.
And you were working on a piece on hip hop.
Yes.
And so when the book came out, I was like, okay, this is a really different trajectory. What brought you to Senegal? Right? And there's some ways in which, as an anthropologist, it's not the question of what brought you to Senegal. The question is the capital piece, right? And I know there's been kind of a flourishing now of a kind of anthropology of business or anthropology of finance. What interested you about the money piece of this?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think, you know, I did a PhD at the University of Chicago, and the chair of my dissertation committee was Jean Komroff. I worked also with John Komroff, so, you know, medical and legal anthropologist. Right. But I would say I was initiated into anthropology by Michel Rolfe-Trouillot, who's like a historian of the Atlantic world. So I think I always had an interest in sort of a broader conversation between Africa and the Americas, Africa and the African diaspora. So even as I was sort of being trained as an anthropologist and as a sort of historical anthropologist, I sort of was interested in several conversations at the same time. One of those was sort of hip hop. You know, I think growing up as part of the hip hop generation, and also reading your work and other influential work, I think I always thought about sort of how I explain the discrepancy between like my experience doing a PhD. You know, I started my PhD when I was 21, and meanwhile we were sort of reading and learning about mass incarceration. Right. I remember, I'm a proud graduate of Morris Brown College, but I started at Morehouse College, and I remember at Morehouse, they used to rattle off statistics about where other black men were in relation to where we were. This number of black men are incarcerated, this number of black men never finished high school, but you are different, you're special. This was the narrative. And instead
Y'all
of
are Morehouse men.
Right. Instead of making me feel sort of, I guess, privileged with respect to those other young men in different situations, it always made me, one, feel like I had to do more work on their behalf, but also wonder what had happened to them,
Yeah.
So I think exploring hip hop was in part about looking at this sort of artistic, intellectual, theoretical movement that was trying to interrogate this problem, like trying to explain what's happening, right? And I always say, like 100 years from now, people will look at hip hop and it'll be their way to understand war, crime, poverty,
mass
violence,
incarceration,
masculinity, mass incarceration. But at the time, as rappers are producing this music and this lyricism, it's often seen as sort of contributing to problems rather than illuminating problems, right? So I think I was really interested in just, being sort of part of this generation and this demographic, how hip hop can be used to sort of illuminate the broader problems people are facing and struggling with.
You're watching Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're joined today by Professor Michael Ralph of NYU, who's the author of the book Forensics of Capital, published by University of Chicago Press 2015. You're visiting here, Duke, to give a talk on before the 13th, as in 13th Amendment, and this larger history, or earlier history at least, of convict leasing. Talk a little bit about what is this project that you're working on now.
Sure, yeah, and actually, I guess I'll start by sort of explaining like how I got to this project from the other work that you've mentioned. So, I did my doctoral research on Senegal, and then, I found something fascinating as I was doing that research. Although the book became more historical and theoretical, there's sort of a problem I discovered in the research, which was about young people using sports to leave the country. And a lot of young people especially were interested in basketball, and there were a lot of recruiters and coaches going to Senegal, recruiting basketball players. There'd even been a basketball academy built. And so a lot of both Senegalese men and women were leaving Senegal to play basketball in the US and elsewhere. And I was really interested in the question of how people decided how much an athlete's skill set is worth. How much an athlete's body or life is worth. So I was reading stuff on like slavery and insurance and actuarial science, just anything that could help me explain how people are valued monetarily. And in the course of that, I sort of discovered that the way that historians talked about life insurance did not sort of accord with the data I had found. So, often people made this sort of categorical distinction between slaves who were insured and people who insured their own lives, saying that slaves were property, and that sort of property insurance is categorically different than life insurance. And it's true that like the life of an insured slave was not based on an actuarial table like life insurance ultimately would be. But it's also true that, after the slave trade to the U.S. was outlawed, but slavery was still legal in the U.S., a lot of people preferred to rent out slaves rather than sell them because they wanted to continue to make money from them. And as they would rent them out, they would insure them. And ultimately, the slaves who were insured for the highest rates were slaves with skill sets like blacksmiths, coal miners, slaves who were like bureaucrats, like clerks, slaves who managed households like butlers and maids. And so there was a kind of direct correlation between how much a slave was valued in an insurance policy and that person's skill set. So there was a kind of interesting relationship then with life insurance because the slaves who were insured either had premium skill sets or they worked in really hazardous industries. And it was in the course of that research that I sort of built this Excel spreadsheet and I also ultimately worked with this coding firm called Resilient Coders to make an online sort of archive and ledger that's called the Treasury of Weary Souls. And in the course of that research, though, I noticed that initially in the data, the slaves who worked in Kentucky, their occupations weren't listed. So I was trying to figure out what they must have been doing, what were their skills, and what made them so valuable. And as I researched that, I found that in Kentucky, enslaved people usually worked in hemp. And then meanwhile, as I was doing archival research in Kentucky, I found a memo from the warden of Kentucky's first prison to the governor saying that he didn't want to produce hemp anymore in the prison, although it had been the leading source of revenue for 3 decades. And so I thought that was interesting because slavery had been associated with hemp, but I never knew about prison labor and hemp.
Right.
And so I was fascinated by that connection and did more research on that first prison in Kentucky and discovered that someone, a merchant named Joel Scott, had persuaded the Kentucky legislature to lease the prison to him, and he would run it as a private business, and he would give them a percentage of the profits. And that was several decades before the 13th Amendment. So
Right.
I was sort of struck by this discrepancy between like the broader narrative that the 13th Amendment is essentially what made possible convict leasing, and this sort of history in Kentucky where there was a prison where inmates were forced to do the kind of labor that enslaved people had been doing several decades before the 13th Amendment, and it was actually a lease,
Yeah.
because there had been other prisons where inmates were exploited for their labor, but this was sort of the first documented use of a lease where the prison was taken over by a private business person and run as a private business, and then the state just received a percentage of the profits. So
It's a fascinating history. You're working on a book project now around it, and it's as a graphic piece as opposed. I mean, talk about your interest in telling the story that way, as kind of a graphic piece as opposed to a more traditional scholarly text.
Yeah, I guess I decided to do a graphic book in part because I thought, 13th, the documentary, have been very influential for sparking widespread interest in this relationship between slavery and incarceration. So I wanted to engage that argument and show, I guess, that it had an earlier history, but I also wanted it to be in a medium that could travel or a medium that might be accessible to the public. And so I thought, okay, I don't know if I want to make a film because it wasn't clear to me how to go about doing that or how to finance that. But then I thought, okay, at least in a graphic book, it can sort of travel and circulate and can be read widely. Maybe I'm influenced by, I think, a turn to graphic publishing, a sort of more interest in that, right? Like Ta-Nehisi Coates writing Black Panther comic, Eve Ewing is going to be writing Ironheart, Iron Man series. So I guess I'm sort of aware of the fact that more people are sort of gravitating toward that genre, both the public and also scholars writing in that medium. And so I think it appealed to me. And so I decided ultimately to have Frederick Douglass be the narrator of the story because he sort of engaged in a very specific way with this history. One, at the 1893 World's Fair, he gave a speech where in part he sort of condemned convict leasing and talked about the way that it preserved this very exploitative labor structure and had this detrimental impact on African Americans. But he also, in 1847, had this exchange with Henry Clay in the North Star, the journal that Douglass published, where he sort of really criticized Henry Clay for taking up this public posture of being against slavery and yet insisting that it cannot be ended yet. And, Clay was really like a mentor to Abraham Lincoln, and a lot of people essentially say that, historians will say that Lincoln's position was essentially Clay's position, which is that slavery was an abomination, it should be ended, but it can't be ended yet, or else that would be detrimental to many U.S. farmers and to the Union. And so Frederick Douglass is very critical of that position, and he sort of points to the fact that Henry Clay owned slaves himself. And the kind of enslaved people that Henry Clay owned worked on hemp farms. And so for me, Frederick Douglass was the ideal narrator because he both had condemned convict leasing, the system of convict leasing, and also because he'd been critical of the way that slavery was practiced in Kentucky, and that had actually involved slaves working on hemp.
Were you surprised by the reaction to, say, Ava Duvernay's film? It seems as though the film started a conversation about a piece of American history that very few people know about. And in some ways it shouldn't be surprising, right, when you consider someone like Kanye West having this amazing platform that he does, tweeting things about abolishing the 13th Amendment. But you chose to even complicate that history by going further back. And to do it as a graphic piece, again, to make it much more accessible. How much do you feel the pressure as a scholar, particularly someone, as you mentioned earlier, who kind of came up in the hip hop generation, to find that balance between, what we think about in the academy as erudite scholarship, but also work that's more accessible, to a broader public?
Yeah, I appreciate that question because it's something that I think as scholars we struggle with. Like I've been told by higher administration at NYU that no one's ever been promoted to a higher rank based on anything other than a scholarly book. And that's interesting because as scholars, none of us think that a scholarly book is the only way to make a scholarly intervention.
Right.
None of us think that that's the only kind of scholarly object we deem valid.
Right.
Like we know many scholars who are involved in curatorial practices, who publish poetry, who engage in a number of different media, and yet the standard for promotion is often restricted to a book that's recognized by scholars who are experts. And what's interesting about that claim is that now that there are scholars writing comics and writing graphic novels, it seems that a scholarly intervention that's in a graphic form could be sent to those experts and evaluated just the way a scholarly book is evaluated. So it's more like deans or higher administration officials who have an investment in a very particular genre and privilege one genre or a few genre over others, right? So it's more like being deeply invested in that in a way that sort of defies even the scholarly merit of the project, right? Like often you were told it matters less what it says than it matters that it's in that form. But to your question, in terms of the 13th, the documentary in particular, I was both really impressed with its impact. I think I'm really happy that it's done so much to spark that conversation. And I think I was surprised by how many people were unaware of that, right? Because I guess as scholars, many of us thought already that 13th Amendment did not really abolish slavery so much as sort of help it get translated in other ways. But I think I'm glad that argument traveled. I guess it had a sort of inadvertent consequence that I only discovered by doing this research, which is that it has led some people to think that slavery and incarceration are essentially the same thing. So now that I give talks or have conversations with people, people will debate whether or not mass incarceration is literally the same thing as slavery.
They're going to decouple that.
Right, and it never occurred to me that people really were thinking of it as exactly the same thing, as no different essentially than slavery. So on the one hand, we see these histories being tied together, both in my research and also in 13th. On the other hand, I guess it's important to think about how incarceration changes with time, how enslavement changes over time, how different forms of labor that's coercive and unfree can have similarities, they can overlap, they can intersect, but they can't necessarily be reduced to the same thing, right? Like the particular demographic, the particular experience, the particular institutional configuration matters when we're talking about different kinds of exploitation, different forms of profit, different forms of coercion, So.
You're watching Left to Black. We've been joined today by Professor Michael Ralph, who's Associate Professor in the Department of Social and Cultural Analysis at NYU. He's also the Director of the Metropolitan Studies Program and the author of the book Forensics of Capital, published by the University of Chicago Press 2015. Thanks for joining us, Michael.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts. And every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black everything, everything black. Culture over everything, y'all. We take